March 10, 1988. Andy Gibb died at the age of 30. Too young to become a complete legend, and too famous for his death to pass as a mere brief headline. His heart gave out after years of a body worn down by a life lived too fast, by quiet collapses, and by seasons of burning himself out just to keep pace with the lights. There was no farewell on stage, no carefully prepared final night, only a sudden silence, leaving behind an unsettling feeling. A man once hailed by all of America as the Prince of Pop, disco, vanished as if he hadn't yet finished living his life. Less than a decade earlier, Andy had been the radiant dream of the late 1970s. Young, handsome, with a soft, emotionally rich voice, appearing everywhere. At just 19, he achieved a rare record with 3 consecutive debut singles hitting #1 on the Billboard charts. Success that arrived so quickly he barely had time to understand who he was becoming. But behind the magazine cover's smile were opposing forces that crushed him bit by bit. A talent desperate for his own voice, yet constantly pulled back into the shadow of the Gibb name. A heart longing to be loved as a human being, yet consumed as a product. A star praised for being perfect, while slowly fracturing from within. That erosion did not happen in a single moment. It lasted long enough to strip Andy of his ability to stand firm. So what did he lose to hold on to that glow of fame? Andy was born in 1958, at a time when music was already the family's lifeblood. By the moment he cried for the first time, the Bee Gees were no longer boys singing for fun. They were already on a professional path, living with recording studios, tour schedules, and fame. Andy's earliest memories were not of classrooms or playgrounds, but of backstage corridors and cars leaving home before dawn. In those early years, Andy did not lack the things many children could only dream of. Music was everywhere. In the living room, in the car, in adult conversations revolving around melodies, lyrics, and the next stage to conquer. He learned how to listen to music before he learned how to distinguish what was truly his own space. When his brothers left home to perform, Andy stayed behind with a feeling that was both pride and dislocation, as if the familiar world was always moving forward, while he stood watching from behind. Material comfort and attention arrived early as well. As the Bee Gees rose to fame, Andy grew up in a life completely different from that of his peers. School became a place of uneasy belonging. Chauffeured cars and family stories of celebrity made the young Andy both admired and isolated. At an age when many children are searching for friendship and identity, Andy was already aware that he carried an unusual name, a surname that made people look at him differently. The first guitar Andy held was not meant for performing, but for imitating the melodies he heard every day at home. His eldest brother did not impose, but remained a steady presence, handing Andy his first guitar, listening to tentative tunes, encouraging him to write songs and sing by instinct. To Andy, Barry was both a teacher and the ideal image of an artist already embraced by the world. That closeness offered safety, but it also quietly set a standard against which Andy would never stop measuring himself. As he entered adolescence, Andy devoted more and more time to music than to ordinary routines. He left school early, drifting between rehearsal rooms, small stages, and trips with the family. Standing in front of a crowd, even awkwardly, gave Andy a rare sensation, being seen not as the Bee Gees' little brother, but as an individual trying to find his own voice. Yet beneath that excitement, Andy's sense of self remained fragile, still unformed, while the world around him had already grown accustomed to placing expectations on him far beyond his years. In his earliest years in music, Andy Gibb did not emerge as a child pre-placed under the spotlight. He began writing songs very young, recording his first demos before he was old enough to fully understand what a career even meant. In 1974, Melody Fair was born in that context. not as a carefully engineered project, but as Andy's way of carving out a space for himself, a place to sing, to experiment, to stand before an audience without borrowing the fame of his brothers. The shows on the Isle of Man were small, unglamorous, sparsely attended, but they were enough for Andy to learn what it felt like to stand alone on stage, facing the audience's response directly. Music came to Andy then with the pure exhilaration of youth. He threw himself into rehearsals, demanded seriousness from the band, and insisted on avoiding alcohol and drugs, as if some instinct warned him that he needed to protect something fragile. At the same time, the life around him lacked the harshness the Bee Gees had once endured. Melody Fair was managed by his mother. Big decisions did not place Andy on the brink of collapse if things failed. When gigs thinned out, when opportunities didn't arrive as hoped, these were slow steps, not sudden falls. Australia was chosen as the next place for Andy to sharpen his craft, but that journey carried a very different tone from his brother's story. The Bee Gees had passed through Australia in deprivation and frustration, forced to play to survive. Andy arrived with quiet family backing, with existing media attention, and with the reassurance that there was always a way back. Studio sessions, appearances on local television, and songs like Words and Music came into being not under the pressure of having to succeed, but in an in-between state. Serious enough to prove ability, yet not harsh enough to force him into an all-or-nothing fight. Words and Music didn't lift Andy high, but it didn't make him disappear either. His voice was acknowledged, his stage presence noticed. He didn't fail, but he also didn't truly overcome anything monumental. And it was in this middle ground that Andy's career began to take on a distinctive trait. He moved forward without being pushed into a corner, but precisely because of that, he was never forced to ask what he would stand on if all the support vanished. In Andy's journey, Barry was not only present as an older brother or a professional guide. At a deeper level, Barry was a living measure of how far success could go when time was on your side. He shielded Andy from the industry's rough edges, opened studio doors, deflected public scrutiny, and stood ready to catch his younger brother whenever needed. Yet that protection carried a quiet pressure of its own. Barry had gone too far ahead, too solidly, leaving almost no room for visible mistakes. Andy wasn't burdened with having to be like the Bee Gees, nor with repeating their path. What weighed on him more was the sense that he wasn't allowed to fail the way they once had. The Bee Gees' early missteps were softened by time. Andy's deviations unfolded under the direct gaze of the public. In 1977, Andy walked into the studio with a strange feeling. Everything was happening too fast, yet no one seemed inclined to slow it down. The song handed to him came without lengthy explanations. Just a few chords, a few brief directions, the familiar voice of Barry on the other side of the room. Andy stood at the microphone, headphones on, the red light switching on. He sang by instinct, the same instinct he had carried since childhood, watching his brothers perform from the wings. There was no ceremonial marker, no declaration of something momentous, just a recording session like any other. A few months after its release, I Just Want to Be Your Everything began climbing the charts, before reaching #1 on the Billboard chart in late July 1977, when Andy was still not yet 20. He became the top name on America's biggest chart so quickly that the sense of victory barely had time to form before being swept away by the next step. Success followed success. Love Is, Thicker Than Water, then Shadow Dancing, each claimed the #1 spot. 3 consecutive debut singles at the top of Billboard, a record never before achieved by a solo artist. American television filled with his image, from stages and music programs to teen magazines. The public saw a youthful, magnetic face, always ready with a smile. Andy saw a sequence of days with no space to slow down. In the studio, he worked hard and with discipline. Recordings were completed quickly, efficiently, according to formulas already proven to win the market. Andy sang accurately, gaining increasing control over both his voice and his presence. But when sessions ended, he often stayed behind longer than anyone else. Some nights, Andy sat listening back to his own voice. Not to fix it, but to reassure himself that the sound coming from the speakers still belonged to him, that it hadn't been completely swallowed by expectations or by the relentless speed of success. Andy was not merely a voice chosen at the right moment. From early on, he wrote music, instinctively exploring melodic structures and lyrics that did not fully align with prevailing commercial formulas. Yet that ability was rarely placed at the center. In the whirlwind of rapid success, Andy's music was often finished by hands already skilled at manufacturing hits, while his personal songwriting lived at the margins, recognized as potential but never pursued long enough. He could write, but he had no room to take risks, to accept songs that might not immediately reach the masses. When the market demanded precision over experimentation, Andy was encouraged to perfect his role as a performer rather than becoming an artist with the time to search for his own compositional voice. In 1978, the album Shadow Dancing was released and quickly became one of the dominant products of the disco era. Bigger stages, brighter lights, denser waves of cheers. The crowd parted as Andy stepped forward with the confidence of an artist at his peak. Yet, inside, the feeling was very different. Everything was happening the right way, too perfectly, leaving no room for hesitation or trial and error. At the very moment Andy stood at the center of the spotlight, the disco era began to reveal a barely visible crack. In 1978, everything still moved smoothly. Thick drum beats, bass lines hugging the floor, stage lights dissolving into shimmering bands of color, and audiences believing this music could last forever. But by 1979, a backlash emerged from the very place where disco had once ruled. Disco Demolition Night in Chicago was more than a noisy spectacle. It signaled that part of the public wanted to smash a cymbal to prove it had grown out of something. From there, American taste shifted quickly. Rock grew rougher, new wave rose with cold, angular sounds, and favored voices began to carry a distance disco never required. Andy didn't disappear because audiences turned their backs on him. They turned their backs on an era, and he stood right at its center. When the current changed direction, the hardest part wasn't singing worse, but finding a way to exist when what you represented suddenly became something people wanted to leave behind. There were mornings when Andy woke up in an unfamiliar room, stared at the ceiling, and needed a few seconds to remember which city he was in. The schedule was so dense that every place began to look the same. Fame gave him no time to put down roots. He lived in a constant state of transition, from studio to stage, from airplane to hotel, from roaring applause to abrupt silence. The following year, Andy Gibb remained a familiar face in mainstream pop. He was still loved, still performing before large audiences, still a symbol of a generation that listened with emotion rather than skepticism. But his presence within his own life had begun to fall slightly out of rhythm. Not enough for outsiders to notice, only enough for the person inside to feel. There was no collapse at that moment, just a quiet reality taking shape. Andy was moving through the echo of his most brilliant period, having never truly learned how to stand steady when everything arrived too fast, too full, and left no space for him to step back and understand where he was. Running alongside that shift was another pressure, the image the media fixed onto Andy. In the late 1970s, America wanted a face that could enter living rooms without controversy, and Andy fit the mold. Young, handsome, approachable, he became the Prince of Pop on magazine covers and television screens. But that affection narrowed his options. Andy was rarely allowed to change. Every appearance required the same measured smile, the same calibrated emotion, the same controlled warmth. He performed that role so well that the space for experimentation kept shrinking. When taste moved toward colder, sharper sounds, Andy was still held inside a familiar frame. Not because he couldn't step out, but because the public had learned to remember him that way. In the studio, Andy Gibb still stood in his usual place behind the soundproof glass, headphones on, the red light switching on as it had for years. The voice still came through with precision. The process still flowed, but the feeling had changed. It was no longer the beginning of a new wave, but one link in a chain of tasks to be completed. When new songs were released, the atmosphere of anticipation was no longer the same. They arrived on schedule, were played, mentioned, and then drifted past. The sense of waiting that had accompanied I Just Want to Be Your Everything or Shadow Dancing was gone. Andy's music retained its polish, but the market had begun to turn its attention elsewhere. He didn't fall off the charts. He simply no longer occupied the position that made every movement pause to watch. After Dark arrived in 1980 within that context. The album still contained well-liked tracks, still revealed a voice fully accustomed to the studio and the stage. But this time, the songs needed a harder push to hold attention. Success no longer came by the momentum of past victories. Each release had to find its own path, and that path was narrower than it had been in the early years. In recording sessions, Andy worked carefully, maintained discipline, and met every requirement on time. He did not lose control of his voice or his stage presence. What changed was the context. The sessions were no longer the starting point of a new wave, but part of a sequence of work that had to be finished. Music no longer cleared its own way. It demanded constant adjustment to keep pace with a market that was rapidly changing. Television began to appear more frequently in Andy's work schedule. Solid Gold became a familiar stop, where he showed up regularly in front of the camera, serving as both host and a representative face of contemporary pop music. On camera, Andy retained his natural ease and charm, fluent speech, the familiar smile, the bearing of an artist long accustomed to public attention. That presence kept him within the public's line of sight, even as new songs no longer produced the instant impact they once had. On Solid Gold, Andy occupied a very particular middle ground. He was no longer a newcomer who needed to be introduced, yet he was not a name viewed through nostalgia either. The camera didn't ask him to create a new wave. It needed him to keep a familiar rhythm running. That steady presence offered a rare sense of stability during a period when his music no longer led the market's movement. But that same stability gradually framed Andy within an image of being pleasant, famous enough to be invited, safe enough not to disrupt. On television, he was always on time, always in frame, always at the right emotional register. Solid Gold kept Andy visible to the public, but at the same time softened the possibility of seeing him as an artist, actively searching for a new direction. The travel continued, city after city, with the same daily rhythm. The schedule didn't thin out, but the feeling of moving forward began to change. Performances were still well attended, but they no longer felt like events. Andy wasn't forgotten. He simply wasn't standing where change began. By 1981, Andy Gibb remained a familiar name in mainstream pop. He was still loved, still appearing regularly, still working without pause. But to remain steady, he now had to be more deliberate, about choosing direction, about holding attention, about defining where he belonged in a market that no longer revolved around his name. This phase wasn't marked by a fall. but by the need for greater intention with every appearance, and for each release to carve out its own narrow path. Within that space, Andy kept moving, not in the explosive glow of 19, but in a tighter corridor where each step required self-generated momentum. And it was precisely in this stretch of motion that his career began to demand something his peak years had never forced him to learn: how to exist when victory was no longer waiting ahead. The echo of his chart-topping years hadn't fully faded before Andy's schedule began to take on a different shape. Not a rupture, but an off-axis shift. The studio was still there, but no longer the sole center. Stages and cameras began to occupy more of daily life. Andy passed through this phase without any ceremonial decision. Everything unfolded in a distinctly American way. Invitations arrived first, the need for presence followed, and the artist simply stepped into positions already prepared. And when the studio ceased to be the only center, maintenance gradually replaced exploration. Everything still ran on schedule, only the energy required to keep the rhythm increased little by little. Alongside television came a succession of live shows. The stage was still lit, the crowds still large, but the feeling had changed. Performances were no longer anticipated as new events, but as familiar appointments. Andy walked out, sang the songs audiences already knew, received applause at the expected moments, left the stage on time. The work was professional, smooth, without error. The only difference was this: the stage was no longer where everything began. It had become the place where everything was maintained. Vegas appeared as the next step, almost inevitable. There, the lights never went out, schedules were fixed, and stability mattered more than surprise. For Andy, Vegas was not an endpoint, but a safe space to keep standing before an audience without having to chase the constant swings of the pop market. Each night repeated familiar melodies, familiar reactions, a sense of control that the previous years had rarely allowed him. Across consecutive weeks of performances, there was no moment large enough to be called a turning point. Andy showed up on time, did his job, left the stage to the same familiar applause. But in the brief transitions, dressing room to car, hotel to stage, his body began responding in ways the schedule did not account for. Sleep shortened. Mornings no longer carried the feeling of recovery, only just enough rest to keep moving. Some nights, Andy lay still in his hotel room with the lights off, listening to his own heartbeat more clearly than the noise in the hallway. Not pain, not panic, just a strange signal, as if his body were trying to remind him of a limit he had never touched before. At work, change arrived quietly. Andy began relying more on familiar structures, songs the audience already knew by heart, prearranged camera frames, schedules repeated down to the minute. Not because he had lost the ability to experiment, but because experimentation required space, something his life no longer had in reserve. Those around him saw an artist still working steadily. But for Andy, control no longer came from within. It came from everything around him continuing to function correctly. When shows ended on time, broadcasts went smoothly, schedules stayed intact, he knew he was still standing. And that dependence on external order made even the smallest deviation feel more unsettling than it should. The deviations arrived in small units: a bit less sleep, fatigue that lingered longer, the need to prop up his working rhythm instead of being carried by it as before. One reality slowly formed. Andy had begun to spend more energy maintaining a state that once came naturally. The career continued, the light stayed on, but for the first time, standing upright was no longer a reflex. It became an effort. Those signs did not immediately interrupt his work. Performances stayed on schedule, tapings went ahead as planned. Andy continued appearing in the same familiar frames, with the poise honed over years in front of the camera. But between those points, rest nearly disappeared. There were no longer breaks long enough for his body to recalibrate. Every pause was filled with movement. On overnight flights, Andy often sat still, headphones on but no music playing. The cabin lights dimmed, the engine's hum became a steady backdrop. There were no audiences, no schedules, only a body left to carry its own state. At times, the exhaustion wasn't in his muscles, but in a nameless emptiness, as if a familiar energy had been drained away. While the schedule still demanded he operate as before, the shift began to affect how Andy prepared for work. He no longer entered the studio with eager anticipation of something new, but with the mindset of completion. Sessions focused on maintaining stability, minimizing errors, avoiding unnecessary variables. Everything was streamlined to ensure results. Not from lack of ability, but because the margin for risk had vanished. Those working with him saw an artist still serious and responsible. Andy didn't skip sessions, wasn't late, didn't cause disruptions big enough to draw attention. But that persistence came with a new tension. Everything had to go exactly right. Because a single misalignment could shake the entire structure he was leaning on. In rare moments of downtime, Andy began turning to ways of keeping himself alert and moving forward. Not to seek new sensations, but to hold on to an old rhythm, the one his body used to provide naturally, but no longer did on its own. It wasn't a major decision, nor a clear crossing of a line. Just a small choice, emerging from lack of sleep, steady pressure, and the feeling of always having to be ready. In that state, Andy started thinking about things beyond the stage, not as an escape, but as a very specific need, to find a space where the pace wasn't dictated by broadcast schedules or applause. The rare free hours were no longer used purely for rest, but to relearn how to focus on something that didn't require an audience. Andy enrolled in flight lessons. The sessions were quiet, governed by strict, slow procedures. In the cockpit, there were no lights, no stage, no pass to carry, only the instrument panel, the sky ahead, and a different order, where everything had to be correct. But nothing had to impress. For Andy, it was a rare feeling, being present without having to perform. Alongside those lessons, he returned to music more cautiously. No flashy launches, no pressure to create an immediate impact. Andy wrote in small spaces, recorded simple demos, sent them to his brothers as a way of checking back in with himself. Music at this point wasn't aimed at the market, but at recovering a familiar feeling that had been lost amid years of constant movement. The Gibb family listened. Conversations were quiet, unpublicized. Island Records began considering collaboration, not as a loud comeback, but as a controlled return. Everything moved more slowly, more carefully, matching the state Andy was trying to build. But his body did not keep pace with those plans. The fatigue signals that had once appeared sporadically became clearer. Breaks no longer brought the recovery they once had. Andy was still present, still working. But every step forward now required more deliberation than necessary. Any return, if it came, would no longer be a matter of will or talent, but of the limits his body allowed. As the lights thinned and the schedule stopped carrying him forward, by the momentum of earlier years, private life began to come into clearer view. Not as a newly constructed refuge, but as an inevitable part of a journey that had moved too fast. Family appeared not to change him, but to place him in a different rhythm. One without a finished role, without applause on cue, and without the option of escape by simply leaving the stage. Andy entered marriage at a very young age, at a time when most of his life was still governed by tour schedules and recording studios. With Kim Reeder, family life offered a rare pocket of quiet, a place where mornings did not begin with airplanes or stage lights, but with ordinary routines. For a brief time, That sense of normalcy brought Andy a feeling of safety he had never known during the explosive years. There, he did not need to be a symbol, did not need to maintain a consistent public image. When his daughter Peta was born, Andy's role opened into another dimension. In those rare private moments, he was no longer the familiar radio voice or television face, but a young father learning how to be present. Time at home, however short, gave him a feeling of stillness. Not because everything was stable, but because for the first time he was not required to keep moving. Yet that closeness also exposed what the previous pace of life had concealed. Family life does not run on a schedule that can be completed and left behind. Fatigue does not disappear after a performance. Uncertainty is not softened by applause. Andy entered marriage as the same person who had lived too long at high speed, and family life, rather than slowing things down, forced him to confront his own internal rhythm. Distance began to appear not through major conflict, but through subtle misalignment. While work still demanded regular visibility, private life required a different kind of presence, deeper, more sustained, without the cover of lights. Andy did not abandon responsibility, but he also did not have enough space to learn how to balance two worlds pulling him in different tempos. The marriage ended while both were still very young. There was no defining incident, only the sense that they had entered family life before either had fully learned how to stand on their own. For Andy, the separation was not loud, nor did it become a public focal point. It passed quietly, like so many things in his life, leaving a void that work could fill but could not resolve. Afterward, Andy continued to appear in public with his familiar composure. But family life left a distinct mark. For the first time, he became clearly aware that not every space could be controlled through discipline and professional habit. Some relationships cannot be completed and left on schedule. Some roles cannot be set aside when the lights come on. In Andy's story, family was not the cause of what followed. It was the clearest mirror of something that had existed from very early on. A person who grew up too quickly in his career, without enough time to learn how to live slowly within relationships that require endurance. When the lights were no longer the sole center, what had never fully formed within him became more visible, not through tragedy but through prolonged exhaustion. As the final years closed, Andy's story did not end at a single moment, but slowly dissolved into public memory. There was no complete comeback, no prepared farewell, only a silence that followed a journey that had moved too fast, where the body could no longer keep pace with what life had demanded of him. And so Andy left the spotlight in a way very different from how he had entered it. Without noise, without controversy, without time to leave behind another choice. His hits continue to play. On the radio, in the memory of a generation, in playlists where listeners do not need to remember the singer's name. That voice carries the unmistakable emotion of a particular era. Clear, vulnerable, unguarded. But behind the familiar melodies lies a story that cannot be rewound. The story of a person given the spotlight before learning how to stand steadily in the dark, of a talent that grew faster than the person himself. Andy Gibb therefore exists not only as the Bee Gees' younger brother, nor merely as a pop phenomenon who came and went. He is a quiet reminder of the cost of fame that arrives too early, when success appears before there is time to understand who you are and how you want to live beyond the stage. Not every voice is given the chance to mature alongside the person behind it, and Andy remains one of the most heartbreaking examples of that misalignment. In the history of mainstream pop, Andy is among the rare figures remembered more vividly in silence. He did not leave behind a legend built on controversy, declarations, or a late-life return. What remains is primarily emotion, the pure, unguarded feeling tied to the memory of a time when pop music was listened to with the heart more than with skepticism. Andy's songs do not survive because of his life story. Rather, it is the music that draws people back to that life with softened understanding. When his voice plays, it does not demand explanation or reconstruction. It only needs to be heard, as a very thin slice of the past that still holds the power to move the present. If Andy had been given more time to grow outside the spotlight, to live at a slower pace than the one the world imposed on him, would pop history have turned in another direction? No one can answer that. What we do know is this: some voices stop too soon, not because talent runs out, but because life asks of them more than a young person can carry.